Welcome to the October update from the Microsoft Australia OEM server team. In this session, we'll be primarily focusing on two main areas, which is the SQL Server 2005 end of support, as well as the additional products that are being added in terms of a new ROK option for SQL Server 2014 and some new licensing options for Windows Server. We'll also be covering some licensing topics as we go through this, just as reinforcement. So let's jump into the SQL 2005 end of support and ROK availability. So if we take a look at the support lifecycle for SQL Server 2005, one of the rapidly approaching dates that we've got here is that SQL Server 2005, it's already at the end of mainstream support. That happened over 4 years ago. And now we're rapidly approaching extended support, which will occur in April in 2016. So that's really only giving us around 6 months or so from where we are now. So I guess the good news here is that for a lot of people, they've already started looking at this, or they've already dealt with the SQL Server 2005 databases they may have had in place as part of their Windows Server 2003 end of support strategies. But for those customers who've been hanging on to older versions of SQL Server, it's important to note that it is approaching rapidly. So that's something that you do need to be aware of. Now, as we take a look at the other options from SQL 2008 R2 and 2008 R2 upwards, you can see here that even though SQL 2008's got a July 9, 2019 support date, I think that's one of the things that we realize that it's really not worth trying to migrate across to a platform where we can already see that we're not going to get that many years out of the solution that we're moving to. So the focus on this is really going to be around moving to SQL 2014 and showing you what some of the benefits are and what the different versions of SQL have added over the last few versions if you haven't been looking at it too closely. So what does the end of extended support mean? Well, first of all, like Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP and Office 2003, etc., it means no more security updates. So with something like your SQL database, in most cases it's going to be run as some type of line of business application. So obviously it's something where you don't want a line of business app or even just some other application you're depending on inside of your organization to still be running and be in an unsupported state. So it also means though for people who are trying to hang on to maybe older hardware, it's getting to the point where that hardware is going to be, it's not going to be running very efficiently. The performance is not going to be great. So you can also look at this in terms of a fantastic opportunity for a hardware refresh if the customer hasn't already done one as part of their Server 2003 migration. Now, the other important thing to take into account here is around compliance concerns. So this is something that people have already started seeing with Windows Server 2003, for example, and Windows XP, that if their industry requires certain types of certification on the infrastructure being used, that unsupported operating systems and applications are not going to allow you to basically get that appropriate tick as needed. So in this case, you need to go through and start, if you haven't already been through the planning process, making sure that you do have the ability to go through, start planning with your customers and moving them across to SQL Server 2014 in a time frame that will work well for the customer. And obviously you don't want to do it during the busiest time of the year for them, but making sure that you do have them done before that April deadline comes up. So some of the other things that we've got here is, as we take a look at some of the benefits, um, you know, some of these may not be that applicable for some of the smaller SMB customers that you may be working with today. But for those of you who've got customers who do rely heavily on SQL Server, it's good to know that things like you've got in-memory performance now, so up to 30 times faster transactions and more than 100 times query performance gains. If you're looking at things like high availability options and disaster recovery options, you've got a lot more flexibility with Server 2014 than what you had with previous versions. Now, we can also scale, so this isn't necessarily something that's always going to be applicable to SMB customers, but obviously for those customers who are pushing SQL Server, the ability to really start pushing it out across more servers and up into higher end hardware is always going to be a good thing. Now, it's also important to note that SQL Server has been the least vulnerable database platform 6 years in a row. So this is really one of those big payoffs from when Microsoft went through the secure by design uh, approach many years ago. So it means it's easy for you to go through and manage your compliance much more easily. And also, if you do move up to SQL 2014, you do have a much longer life cycle in terms of receiving those security updates, support updates, etc., as well as hot fixes. Now, when it comes to the optimization of your data infrastructure, there's support for virtualization. So if you want to run it on bare metal, if you want to run it inside of VMs, taking advantage of the number of CPUs and the amount of memory that you can allocate it, as well as the ability to start integrating it with other online SQL Server solutions, such as some of the SQL options that Azure provides, for example, so that you can have offsite recovery capabilities, effectively without having to go through too many steps to get that up and running. Or even if you're just talking about the integration with the Azure backup capabilities to make sure that you do have good backups of your SQL databases up in the cloud. Now, if we take a look at some of the things that have started changing with SQL Server over the last few versions, this is obviously a very, very small list of what's actually changed over time. But if we start off with SQL 2005 as the base point, which added Management Studio and mirroring, this is where things like database compression came in 2008, policy-based management, programmability. As we moved up to SQL Server 2008, to much stronger SharePoint integration, better data services capabilities, the Power Pivot in-memory capabilities was introduced. Moving up to SQL 2012, this is where more of the we all of a sudden we started getting Power View, the in-memory column store, always-on database replication capabilities for synchronous or asynchronous connectivity, as well as the first time that Microsoft started nodding towards the cloud in terms of different types of integration services. And then finally, as we move into SQL Server 2014, this is where all of a sudden, we're talking about something that really is designed to, work on-prem or work in the cloud, or, in this case, work as a hybrid solution that really gives you the best of both worlds, as well as starting to provide you some additional capabilities depending on, whether you go down the standard or the enterprise path with the product. But we won't really worry too much about the versions for this because the focus is on the SQL 2014 Standard Edition. So just to sum some of the things up that we've just been through, it's been designed for mission critical performance. We've got faster insights, so working with data from different stores, bringing it in and letting SQL handle it. And then finally, the data platform optimization. So if you do need scenarios where you've got an on-premise database, but you need to start pushing it into a cloud environment for other people to work on it, this is the kind of thing SQL Server 2014 makes very, very easy for you. So these hybrid cloud scenarios, it's not about what's better, the cloud or on-premise. It's all about picking and choosing when and where you should have your data in those different locations. And finally, regardless of whether you're looking at on-premise or hosting some of these pieces in the cloud as well, you are using the same set of tools across both options. So, the idea here is to really make it simple for you to move back and forth between them from a management perspective without having to use a completely different set of tools. So why are we talking about SQL Server in a Microsoft OEM server session? Well, primarily it's because starting from the 1st of August, SQL Server 2014 Standard has been available for sale as an ROK product. So how does this work? Well, SQL can't be BIOS locked like your Windows Server operating systems can. So when you go to buy SQL Server through ROK or through ROC, you have to choose up front whether you want to buy it with Windows Server Standard or Windows Server Data Center. So we've covered some of these topics in the past around where would you go for standard versus where would you go for data center. But effectively, you go for data center when you do have virtualization requirements. So it may be that you can instantly see the value in getting a copy of data center with its unlimited VMs, or you can see that within a short time period, the customer is going to realize value from doing that. So it's just a matter of picking and choosing the right path to go down right from the beginning. So how do you go through and sell this? Well, First of all, you need to determine that the customer needs SQL Server standard. So generally, the customer is not going to say, I need a new version of SQL Server. Generally, it's going to be the application that they're using will have a new version that requires a new version of SQL Server, or you as their partner have identified that they need a new version of SQL Server. Then the second piece, select the OS. So do you want standard or data center, as I mentioned, based on virtualization requirements, and then buying the appropriate Windows Server end user CALs as well as the SQL Server CALs as well. So there are CAL requirements for both of these as there normally would be. So for you as the OEM reseller, what are the benefits here? Well, it means that you've got another product that you can offer your customers, and really start looking at other opportunities that you may not have looked at in the past if you have really focused on selling OEM software. So now it means that any kind of OEM incentives that apply to ROK through your preferred distributor or through your preferred OEM will also now uh, apply to these new SQL licenses as well. So you can look at things like improving your attach rate, and effectively, we know that with quite a few products, if you can sell at the time of the server sale, it means you've got a much better chance of getting attach of additional software and services. Now, there's more CAL opportunities here as well, and it also means now that it's important to note here that the support now is something that is provided through the OEM. So because it's an OEM license, if you do need support on this, it's something where everything from the hardware through to the the running of SQL is something that the OEM will be able to support for you. Now, why is it easier for customers? Well, the main reason is that it's an easier transaction, so it's just one item that contains both products. It's easy to deploy, so you can go through and deploy it just based on receiving the physical kit, rather than having to wait to get access to the volume license center, for example, if that's the way the customers have traditionally done it. Now, it's also fully supported by the OEM, as I mentioned. So if the customer's got a strong alliance with one of the major OEMs, this means that they can continue that and now extend it into SQL Server. And the final piece here is the big benefit for customers is being able to go through and bundle it and do it through the OEM channel means that you can take advantage of the OEM licensing in terms of that initial upfront saving, so that if you can go through and apply that. So just a couple of frequently asked questions on this that we've received so far. So how is the SQL bundle different from SQL volume license? So this is still an OEM license. So remember that volume license products do tend to have reassignment rights. It's not necessarily universal, but in general they do. So in this case, the bundles are made up of SQL Server OEM licenses and Windows Server OEM licenses. So you can't go through and reassign them. However, if you do add software assurance, just like you can through for Windows Server, as soon as you add software assurance, you're effectively turning this into an open license, which means that if you do need the mobility, for example, that's something that you can get through this quite easily. So again, just speak to any of your Microsoft distributors, and they'll be able to tell you the pros and cons of which approach will be best for you. So how do you get started with this? Well, there's a few different resources that are available, which will be outlined in this month's newsletter. So you can just refer to the newsletter to get these details. But first of all, in a lot of cases, it's going to be discovering what the customers have got. If it's an existing customer, you've probably already got a good idea of what they've got, and you've already got a plan in place for them. But for those of you who are acquiring new customers, finding out what workloads they've got that are ripe for migration sooner rather than later is something that you can do quite easily with the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Now, for targeting your destinations, really the main one here is that we are going to be targeting SQL Server 2014. And we do have the option of then integrating that with Azure virtual machines and Azure SQL databases, depending on what the customer's requirements are, to have additional copies of that data held off-site. And then finally, for the migration, or for the upgrade, there's quite a few resources available from Microsoft. So we've got things like the SQL Server 2014 upgrade guide. There's the upgrade advisor. So these are things that you'll find the links to in this month's newsletter, so that you'll be able to go through and refer to these quite easily. So now let's move on quickly and just revisit Windows Server 2012 R2 data center licensing. Seeing that I mentioned that in the last section, it's worth revisiting that quickly for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So we're not going to take a look at all of the different versions of Windows Server 2012 R2 that are listed here. Instead, what we'll do is focus on the data center and the standard licensing. Now, they're both licensed from a processor plus CAL perspective, so you need a server license per 2 physical CPUs. It doesn't matter how many virtual CPU, or sorry, how many, I guess, uh, you know, how many cores each of those CPUs have got. Sorry, I had my brain froze for a second there. So all you really need to do is think about, how many VMs and how many CPUs. Now, in most cases, we're going to be talking about servers that have got 2 physical CPUs or less. So all we really need to think about are the number of CALs, either end or user CALs or device CALs. So nothing has really changed from previous versions of Windows there. The other thing we need to think about, though, is how many virtual machines do we need to run? So as I mentioned, with Data Center, it includes an unlimited number of virtual instances. So you can run up in that single installation of Data Center as many virtual machines as you want to. So saying unlimited, well, it's really going to be limited by just what the capacity of that hardware is. So if you've got a customer that's looking at doing some serious consolidation, or they're looking at, setting up some, some clustering, they want failover capabilities, they want live migration capabilities without having to be concerned about the licensing of where the VMs end up, then Data Center really starts making a lot more sense than standard. So with standard, it comes with 2 virtual instances. So those 2 virtual instances mean that you've got, your base OS, which is really just to run the hypervisor level. And then you've got 2 full instances of Windows Server that you can run. So you could run one as a domain controller, one as, a line of business application or remote desktop server, for example. So the way that you've normally done multi-server deployments in a physical environment, continue on now with standard, but in a virtual environment if you choose to do it that way. So we're not going to talk about essentials and foundation. They've been the focus of previous sessions that we've done. So if you're not familiar with Hyper-V, then Hyper-V is Microsoft's offering in the hypervisor space. So for those of you looking at server-based virtualization, this is something that Microsoft provides with Hyper-V on top of Windows Server 2012 R2. So it's been available since the Server 2008 days, and in terms of performance and scale, effectively it can scale up to any workload that you could effectively throw at it. So you've got 64 terabyte virtual drive size, you've got support for large numbers of VMs, large amounts of memory. So the idea here is that it really does give you, very, very high performance that really does scale up to meet the hardware that you put it onto. Now, for virtual machine mobility, you can do things like live migration without any shared infrastructure. So instead of relying on shared storage to be able to do live migrations, this is something that you can do straight out of the box from server to server without that third server or storage device being required. Now, you've also got different clustering options, so you can start doing clustering using shared VHDX files. And you've also got Hyper-V Replica, where we can have replicas of a running VM copied across, snapshots of that copied to another server, and then another copy of that then pushed out potentially, if you choose to an off-premise location, so that if you really do need to go down the data recovery and site recovery path, it really gives you another fantastic option, and this is just stuff that's included with the operating system. Now, the other thing that's important here with Windows Server 2012 R2 and Hyper-V is that they're not just built for Windows. So you've got full support for various operating systems, including a variety of different Linux distributions inside of Hyper-V. So the virtualization strategies here. So for some customers, they may look at Data Center and say, well, we're not quite ready for that. Can we start with stacking Standard Edition? So yes, you can start stacking with Standard Edition. So with this, it means that you buy one copy of, or maybe you could even buy multiple copies of standard edition at the time of the server purchase to gain an additional 2 virtual machines per server. So this means that if a customer says, look, I don't really need enough virtual machines for data center to make sense, if I stack with standard edition, it means that I can go through and I can just get the 4 VMs or maybe 6 VMs that I need. But however, as soon as you start getting above 4 VMs, it's really worth looking more closely at the customer needs and seeing where data center really does start making more sense. Now, we do have some different guides available that will walk you through this, such as on the Windows Server pages, you'll see some simplified approaches around what do you need to do here. So um, it's really just a matter of here, deciding, what makes more sense. You'll see here that they've got a number. Are you running or planning to run more than 5 virtual machines on a server? Now, that's normally the price, or sorry, the breakpoint that people normally look at. So with this though, we've actually had some recent changes though, where instead of thinking about having to sell all of the OEM server licenses at the point of sale, we can actually now start doing some different things with one of the new additions to the Windows Server licensing, which is the Windows Server additional license after point of sale. So it's quite a mouthful, but let's go in and talk about that. So what is it? Well, it's an additional Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 standard license that can be sold as long as there's a base license of either Server 2012 standard or 2012 R2 standard already on the server. Now, you'll see here that it does only apply to standard. It doesn't apply to data center. So what does it give you? Well, it gives you the rights to an additional 2 virtual machines or an additional 2 CPUs. And what's also important with this one is that it comes with additional reassignment rights. So this means that additional licenses can be reassigned the same way that you could do it through a volume license purchase. So this doesn't apply to the base OS. It only applies to the additional license purchase. So it's also important to note that this is quite a unique thing in the OEM channel to get this reassignment right. So this is something that the multinational OEMs will have the ability to also ship this as an ROK, and effectively the only customer requirement is that the customer has to have purchased at least one 2012 or 2012 R2 standard base license from that OEM if they want to use that vendor's ROK version. So what are the benefits for you as the partner? Well, you've got the ability to start growing your revenue by selling the additional licenses. So instead of thinking, well, do we need to sell everything up front? It gives you a bit more flexibility in terms of when you can make the sale, but it also means that you can go through and start looking at the transfer rights, which is something that you never really got through OEM in the past. Again, like the SQL ROK, it means that any kind of OEM incentives that are being applied, or any special promos, etc., that your distributor or OEM is providing, this is something that also is going to be qualifying for those through the OEM purchase piece. Now, another piece that you can think about is that it gives a chance for you to have different conversations when you go back and chat to your customers. So even if they're not in an active buying mode, you can go back, find out what their needs are, and let them know that they've got plans, not necessarily appropriate for them right now, but moving forward, that you can go through and provide a range of different offerings to really meet their needs as their virtualization requirements start changing. So what are the customer benefits? Well, the customers can go through and scale out based on what they need. So for each additional 2 VMs they need, they can just buy another license. They reassign your license. We can't underestimate enough how important this is as people start looking at additional server consolidation in the future, moving VMs to more powerful hardware. This is something that this really does give you a much better ability to do that. And it also means that you can start being compliant. So if a customer does get to the point where they do really need to run that third or fourth, third upwards VM, instead of being non-compliant from a licensing perspective, just adding one of the after point of sale licenses will cover them for those additional 2 virtual machines. And yes, they can continue to stack those up. So we've got a few frequently asked questions on these already, so let's just go through these. So how is the additional license different from volume license? Well, in this case, it stacks on top of an existing base license, whereas a volume license is a standalone license, it doesn't, and then you do go through and download that from the Microsoft site. So remember that you do need to have that base OEM license on the server before you can apply this APOS. Now, can you apply APOS on top of a VL-based license? So no, you can't sell it for stacking on top of a standard volume license installation. But once a customer has purchased an additional license to stack on top of the OEM license, that's when you can then start looking at it in terms of reassigning it to another physical server, in that case, one that does have a volume-based license. So that's a very, very important one. So, so just spend a moment to think about that one. Now, is there a limit to the number of additional licenses that can be stacked on top of a Server 2012 or R2 base license? No. It says any number, but the thing here is to really take a step back before you think about going down this path and think, does it really make more sense to try to get the customer to move towards data center earlier on in the sales process rather than afterwards? Now, there'll be some customers that may be, strapped for cash now, and they'll do this on an as needed basis rather than over investing at the beginning. But just bear in mind that it really doesn't take all that many up and running Windows Server VMs for data center to start making a bit more sense. And finally, is there a time limit? No. So some of you may be used to some of the different time limits around, for example, adding software assurance to OEM product, which is a 90-day window. In this case, it's a matter of there is no time frame within that you have to make this purchase. So that just makes it a little bit easier for you. So now that we've covered that one, let's just revisit one of the things I've mentioned a couple of times quickly without going into any detail, which is around the Windows Server licensing piece. So just on the CAL side, I guess these are things that haven't really changed, but it's still worth pointing out. So first up, we've got user CALs and device CALs. So an important change that came through with Windows Server 2012 and followed up and was the same with 2012 R2 was that it didn't include the 5 base CALs any longer. Instead, you got the additional virtual machine license. So just making sure that you're either supplying the users with the appropriate number of user and or device CALs to cover their usage requirements. Now, another question that does still come up, even though it's something that has really been the same way for an extended time period, is around, well, do I need to buy remote desktop CALs? Well, if you've got users or devices that need to access virtual desktops, remote apps, or session-based desktops, then yes, they do need to go down the path of getting RDS CALs. Now, I guess the area where RDS is a little bit different to user CALs and device CALs is that with RDS CALs, there is actually a licensing engine involved that will eventually kick in and tell you that you need to buy licenses. So don't be surprised if that does occur to you, if someone thinks they've got it working without buying the appropriate licensing. Now, just a couple of frequently asked questions on CALs before we do a quick wrap up. So if I've got an RDS CAL, do I still need to have a Windows Server user or device CAL? So it's yes. The Remote Desktop Services CAL, it just covers the RDS piece. You still need to have the user or device CAL in order to take advantage of that. Is a CAL tied to a specific user or device? And it's like, yes, they are, but you can go through and reassign them. So you don't lose them if a device or a person leaves the organization. You can just reassign those to another user. Now, are CALs specific to each version of Windows Server OS? So its CALs must be the same version of the OS that they're connecting to or from a more recent version. So an example of this is if you've got Windows Server 2012 R2 CALs, then that will apply to 2012 and 2008 R2 downwards, for example. Whereas if you've got 2008 CALs, they won't apply to 2012 or 2012 R2. Now, one thing to be aware of with this though is when it comes to a release such as 2012 and 2012 R2, so basically just going from the regular version to the R2 version, your CALs are usually covered in that scenario. So 2008 to 2008 R2, your 2008 CALs would cover you. 2012 to 2012 R2, your 2012 CALs will still cover you there. So just a little bit different. So are CALs specific to each OEM. No, you can buy cows from any OEM or partner and use them with a server from a different OEM. There's no issue with that. There's no ROK requirement, for example. And is there a difference between OEM and volume license cows? And it's like, no, they've both got the same rights there. So these are really some of the top questions that we do get on the cows. So, you've got different ways to contact us through Smart HQ if you do need to go through and fire off a few more questions about the cows. But otherwise, what I'd like to do is just thank you for joining us on this webinar. Don't forget to go to microsoftsmarthq.com.au to go and post some questions, take a look at additional resources. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'll wrap it up there and look forward to delivering another webinar to you next month. Thank you.